getting books for our new lesson. Actually going to be looking at the marks of a healthy church. Done this previously, back when it was titled 9 Marks. Mark Dever did study in 9 Marks of a healthy church. The newer, updated version. We're going to be looking at this. But to get our minds prepped what we're going to learn, let's start with a few questions. Let's pretend for a moment that we are looking for a church to attend. Maybe you're a new believer, possibly had an issue at the last church, which is a topic for a whole nother study. But in any case, you're faced with finding a church for you and your family, whatever the case may be. What are the qualities that would have you remain at that church? Young pastor, I like that. Energetic. What are some other things? Things that we would look for? Bible-centered. Others? Preaching and teaching God's Word. Structure of accountability all the way to the top. Others? What are things that we would be looking for? We're in search of a church. Okay? So, loving invitation between members of the church to outsiders, themselves, both. Look at the doctrinal statement, what they believe. Okay. Now, exposition, preaching. Go back in your life 10 to 20 years and tell me you were looking for the same thing in a church. How many of you would say, yes, 20 years ago, I was in search of the very same things that I would be in search of today? Al's the only one who admits it. Yes.
Here, 15 years, a couple of the other churches, another 5.
Yes. So, yes. So we would all admit that what we would be looking for today is not the same thing that we would have been looking for as a new believer, let's say, or possibly just even 20 years ago. Maybe you were born again for 10 years at that point, 20 years ago. You wouldn't have been looking for the same thing then as you would be looking for now, right? We're in agreement with that. This is a good thing. We're working towards something. What are some qualities that maybe other folks you know would currently be searching for in whether or not they're going to stay at a church? Children's ministry. Others? Music. Others? Tech savviness. Yes. Others? Gift shop. Coffee bar. Playground. Entertainment. A pastor with a large following. A cross on the wall. These are modern music. Yes. These are things in which people are in search of when looking for a church. When I say people, I'm talking about a large majority of folks who were in search of a church. Why would those qualities be good qualities for those folks. Music, playground, pastor with a large following. Why are these good qualities for someone who's in search of a church? So children's ministry, they want their children to be taught right. Yes. Sure. Yep, and it's obvious that it's a good church with a pastor with a large following because he has a large following. So it's obvious that God is blessing that ministry. These are reasons that people use. These are reasons that people will go through in their mind at looking for a quote-unquote good church. So, give me some examples of the wrong reason to join a church. Music. Children's ministry. Right? It's the same thing. So what we're trying to find out is if we can say there are wrong reasons to join a church or to continue in fellowship with a church, there must inevitably be right reasons, biblical reasons to join a church or to stick with church. Membership is going to be one of the things that we talk about. So what we're looking at here is Mark Devers, the senior pastor of Capitol Hill Baptist Church. Take a guess of where that is. Washington, D.C., on Capitol Hill. He and Jonathan Leeman, Jonathan is a fellow elder at the church and an author, and he's in charge of the 9 Marks ministry, came from that church. These two guys are going to be the ones teaching this lesson that we're going to look at. This is called the Marks of a Healthy Church. It's going to be good for us. It's going to be a very good check. It'll be a check for us as elders on the health of this local body, as well as it will be a good check for us individually as we learn these things. Why are we here? Are we here for the right reasons? Are there wrong reasons that we are here? We're going to look at the scriptures and see how we're doing with our part individually with such things as attendance, membership, using our gifts, missions, and so on. We're going to get a chance in this next probably 20 weeks, if I had to guess, of understanding ourselves corporately and ourselves individually. Good litmus test for us. So, before we begin, let's answer a foundational question. What is the church? Have you ever sat down and asked yourself the question, what is the church? Years ago, people would have said, it's the building, here are the church, here's the steeple, open the doors. The arthritis, this is the people, right? That's what we've been taught. Here's the church, here's what it looks like. It has to have a roof that has this kind of a slope and a steeple on the top and a cross in the front. Is the church. Well, that's not really what the church is. So then, what is the body of believers generated, come together in corporate worship? Okay. Yes? Christ's bride. So these are words that are synonymous with the church. The word used for church in the New Testament is ecclesia, right? So in the English, it doesn't translate into one word, church, right? Ecclesia means the called out ones. So if we're the called out ones, we're called out of what? We're called out of something, and inevitably we're called into something else. So what is it we're called out of? The world's system, world's understanding, the world's love of things, the world's passions for certain places of authority, the world's system, ideas. And we're called into this ecclesia. We're called into church. As believers, we're called into church. So, we as a group here at Pine Creek are an official called out group. So, by name and definition, the church is made up primarily of, back row, the church is made up primarily of, CC says believers. Anybody agree with CC? Believers. The church is made up primarily of believers. Why do I stress the word primarily? So it could depend on perspective. Sure. Yep. So the church is made up primarily of believers. Ask this question as a follow-up. What happens if the roles are reversed and the church is not made up primarily of believers, but rather primarily unbelievers? What takes place in a church like that? Not a church. Why? Club, I would agree. But why is it not a church? Why doesn't God recognize it as a church? What is the definition of the church? A called out assembly. If you're still in the world, you're not called out. Therefore, you are not, by definition, a church. Rather, Lisa says a club. I would agree. Simply just a bunch of people gathering to do something, celebrate something, do whatever. Is it possible to sit in the church and think you're of the church and not be of the church? Is that your question? Thanks. Sure. Yeah. Happens often. Absolutely. Yeah. So do you understand that by definition, if the majority of the people, especially the leaders of the church, are rank unbelievers, even though they have lulled themselves into believing that they're part of the church, universal and corporately, not a church by definition, simply can't be. So, in that case, where we have a primarily overarching overabundance of unbelievers in the church who have lulled themselves into believing that they're part of the church, even with leaders of that church who are unbelievers, how then can that church carry out its primary function? Everybody is saying they can't. Well, wait a second. You're telling me they can't, but they do. They show up there on Sunday, right? Many of them very happy for the fact that they have showed up there on a Sunday. Most of them actually very happy to be there and to have their dose of serotonin that day and feel how great they are and how to live their best life now and how to be uplifted and know that that blessing is coming. Okay, so Rena is saying that there is a litmus test that can be taken for a church who practices such things. And that litmus test is, what does God say about that worship? Yes. Okay. So, these are just questions. These are getting our minds in gear for our very first lesson in our study, which is church, is the lesson. Church. Mark Dever's going to show us that, and I don't think we're going to get to the video today, which is fine. I want to lay this foundation so that we can understand what it is that we're getting ourselves in. These are questions that are foundational. These are questions that we must answer. Like, what is the church? We can't understand how the church is supposed to function if we don't know what the church is. If we don't know what the church is, obviously we don't know how it functions and what the primary goals and setup of the church is to be. So Marvin made mention of something. And he made mention of the fact that how then can they perform the primary functions of the church if they're unregenerate for the majority of folks, if they are not, as Lorena said, being blessed by God for performing these functions in a God-honoring way. Wouldn't it be healthy for us to understand what the church's functions are? Right? The church has functions. It has within itself the job, the duty of performing these things, and that performance is not only duty-driven, but I would say rather joy-driven. And not a joy in the sense of a serotonin kind of releasing of endorphins that makes us feel great, although it does and it should do that when we're doing the functions of the church correctly as God-pleasing. So it is a duty that the church has. God has told the church what to do. God has told the church how to worship. God has told the church what those functions are, what that leadership structure should look like, male versus female roles in the church. All of these things are laid out for us. Where? In the Scriptures, right? Not some live your best life now book, not suggestions for the New Testament church, New Testament church for dummies. It's given to us in the Scriptures. God has revealed how the church is to function. So, what are the functions of the New Testament church? And I know we have a lot of ideas going through our head. Well, it could be, but I don't want to say that because that might be really not something the church should be involved with. There are primarily 5. Could be up to 7, depending on how you would categorize them. Find out from Acts chapter 2, verse 42, as a matter of fact, tells us that as a matter of priority in the church, they stuck to, and we should stick to, teaching and discipleship. And I would say that you could separate those two, because there are teaching opportunities that we have corporately, just like this, that result in discipleship, right? What does discipleship look like after a teaching series such as today? Give me an example of what discipleship would look like at 10:45 to 11 a.m. between our church service and our Sunday school service. What would discipleship look like? Discipleship can look like a conversation about what we just learned in this lesson time. Clarification during that conversation. Hands over here. Learning things again, maybe for the first time, but learning things again is a process of discipleship. There is a corporate discipleship during the teaching time. Then there is an individual discipleship. that takes place sometime after this kind of teaching. And it doesn't necessarily have to be about this topic. Discipleship ranges in its category of learning as vast as the teaching of the Scriptures. But as a disciple, you have to be willing to do what? You have to be willing to be taught. And then what else must you be willing to do as a disciple? Open your mouth and speak to other people, right? So you have those conversations. When I go to Amy and say, Amy, what did you learn today during our Sunday school lesson? Amy hopefully would say, here's something that I caught throughout that lesson, right? That's discipleship. And then we would have that conversation about that, give clarification about things that were said along the way. Yes. Yes. So discipleship is not me giving my opinion. When someone says, how do you think I should handle this financial situation? My opinion may sound something like, I would use a credit card to pay off that credit card. That would be bad advice. Everyone agrees? But it's agreed that those types of things probably aren't very wise, right? So rather, I would point to a biblical picture of the way we would use our finances, whatever that situation may look like, right? So being a disciple is not me finding someone that will listen to me, that I can pour my opinions into and create a mini-me. That's not discipleship. Discipleship is creating disciples that are chasing after Christ, not me. I'm in my discipleship pointing them Scripture, which is ultimately pointing them to God. So that's what the church is primarily functioned to do, to teach and to disciple. That's in Acts 2:24. In Acts 2:45, 2:42. Let's go back to this one first. The church is charged with the function of fellowship. We're charged with the function of fellowship. What does that look like? Are we doing it? Right? This is our litmus test. We're beginning to look at us as a church. What does it look like, Don? Yes. Right. So fellowship is that conversation where we can pick up on discipleship needs, where we can pick up on prayer needs, where we can pick up on financial needs, where we can pick up on marriage counseling needs, where we can pick up. Fellowship has built within it this knitting together of our hearts. Is it detrimental to myself if I refuse the times of fellowship that this church has established and refuse those times of fellowship from invites that I get from individuals within this local body? Is it detrimental to myself? How? The answer was yes. But how is it detrimental to myself? mean, I'm kind of an individual. I really don't need a lot of this corporate kind of stuff. I'm not a kumbaya, let's hold hands and sit around the fire and hug it out kind of guy. I'm kind of a rugged individual. Why then is it hurtful for me to refuse myself from the fellowship times that we have? Why? So we're of one body, and I heard the word need each other to perform properly. Okay, that was the next question. Yes. So, not only is it detrimental to my own health, spiritual well-being, growth in Christ, but it is also detrimental to the church at large, the corporate body that I am part of. If I refuse those times of fellowship, if I negate the fact that John and Danielle have invited me over to their house to share a dinner, and I'll come up with any excuse that I can to not go to their house because I'm a rugged individual who likes to survive on my own, I am hurting them as well as hurting myself. So the fellowship aspect has been providentially put in by God because He knows that we need each other because He built us that way. Fellowship is an intricate part of us growing together corporately. And when you shun those times, hurt yourself, hurt the rest of this body. Don said, how is it then? We had someone years ago, no one knows who they are. They had something happen in their family, and we'd had no idea because they were so casual in attendance, and some time had passed, and they said, we can't believe that you didn't attend to our needs when we had these needs. And we said, we had no idea that you had those needs because we never see you. We just plain didn't know because you're never around. We feel bad. We're so sorry. But we can't help what we do not know. Fellowship is a very important aspect of us as a church body. It's healthy for us, fellowship. It's healthy for us to hang out with one another. Listen to this. It's revolutionary. If you've never heard this before, you're going to hear it for the first time. We need to meet outside of this place throughout the week as well. Because when you come in here and we have a time of hand-to-hand fellowship, and everybody has all the nice things to say, right? How you doing? I'm great. Better than I deserve. I'm so blessed. How are you? I can't wait to hear. How are you? Oh, everything's so great. Not very often that you shake someone's hand during hand-to-hand fellowship that they say, my life's horrible. I'm a complete wreck. I can't keep my mind on track for more than 2 minutes. I need help. That doesn't normally happen during that time. But guess when it does happen? When our relationships are built strong enough from our fellowship that people can say, I'm struggling. I need help. It's not going to happen in the 9 to 5 worships. So it's vitally important that we fellowship with one another, that koinonia. By the way, that fellowship we can only have with believers. Unbelievers can't experience true koinonia. They don't have the bond that bonds us together. Have you ever been someplace, maybe in another state, maybe in another continent, where you meet people that you automatically fall in love with and you have no idea why? They don't look like me, they don't talk like me, they don't dress like me. Why do I love them so much? Because there is an immediate bond through Christ our Savior when we meet believers who don't look like us. Yes, there are times when you have conversations with people who claim to be part of that church, who don't want to have any discussions about the church or the things of the church or the Christ of the church. They want to talk about the Steelers, the Penguins, the Pirates, anything in between, weather-wise, hunting seasons, fishing seasons, you name it, but never get to Christ. And it becomes a conversation that when you leave there, you are left wanting as a believer, right? Just really wish we could have talked about the things of Christ. Couldn't. So then when I leave that conversation, I have to begin to question, is that person really of the church like they claim to be? Are they really Christ's? Because it should be much easier to leap from this conversation into the much weightier, much deeper things of the Spirit. I can't even get past the weather. Absolutely. Yes. Gone to sporting events before and never once mentioned Christ's name during the entire thing, because our aim was to go to this sporting event, right? Right or wrong, that's how we build relationships with folks. So we've seen that the church is charged with things such as teaching and discipleship, charged with fellowship in Acts 2:45, service toward one another. This one's going to sting a little. Service toward one another. In your mind, I want you to raise your hand in your mind. Don't physically show your armpit. In your mind, I want you to raise your hand. Did you come here today to be served? Did you come here today to serve? Feel that little lump right there? Because I'm afraid that most people show up on Sunday morning with the attitude of, serve me. Teach me something. I'll be part of the giving. I'll put my money in the offering plate. I'll be part of that. But I want you to do everything for me. And listen, don't make it uncomfortable, because I won't be back next time if you do, like what you're doing right now. We're charged with serving one another. So if I neglect fellowship, guess what else I'm inevitably going to neglect? My service. How do I know how to serve Al if I don't know a thing about him? I don't even know where Al lives. How am I going to serve Al? Answer is, I'm not. But guess what I'm going to expect every time I show up here? I'm going to expect that each one of those lights are on. Al says, don't look too close. I'm going to expect that John has made the phone call and saw through the fact that the roof doesn't leak out here anymore. As a matter of fact, you know what, Al? It's too hot in here for me. I think you should turn the air conditioner on. You know what, John? It's too cold downstairs when we go down there. Before we go down there, a half an hour before, I want it turned up to 72 so that when I go down there, I can take off my jacket. This is what we do, folks, and we do this subconsciously all the time. We come here and we expect that Marvin's going to teach. We expect that Don is going to preach. We expect that Sam is going to teach us something. We expect that this is going to be in place for my comfort when I come here, without ever once saying, what am I going to do today for someone else? What have I done this week for anyone else? We have to fight this. This is our American idea that has been drilled into our heads since we were children. We have this idea that we should be served. Yes. Yes. Yeah. You don't have to preach. Yes, sir. Yep. That's our next question. Yep. Yep. That's going to be our final question. We're going to get to that one. So we see that the church is charged with teaching and discipleship, fellowship, service toward one another. Acts 2:46 to 47, worship. Corporate worship. Can I say that every time I'm here, I worship? Every single time, without exception. When I show up here, my mere presence is my worship to God. I'm here, therefore I worship. Can't say that, can I? Worship is much deeper than my mere presence in a group of believers as songs are sung, as the word is preached, as all of these opportunities to serve come about. They're all acts of worship. Worship comes from within, not external. This is the big problem with a lot of these quote-unquote megachurches is they focus on the externals, right? If we can sing this verse enough times or this chorus enough times, it's going to lead someone to get into a worshipful state. And oftentimes people will leave there and say, the service was so worshipful today, my heart was so enthralled. What? Not real sure, but my endorphin level was much elevated. I really feel good when I leave there. That's not always a promise that we have, that when we leave church, we're going to feel good. As a matter of fact, if we understand our sin any greater today than we did yesterday, we should feel worse when we leave today than we felt when we left last week. Understanding our own sin nature and the depths of our depravity. Next, Acts 2:47. The church is charged with outreach and evangelism. What the church charged with? Outreach and evangelism. Do we evangelize only inside this building? Of course not, I hear. We don't evangelize only inside this building. This is part of our fellowship. This is part of our building relationships with folks outside of the church. We have opportunities with coworkers, family members. Thanksgiving's coming up in a few weeks, right? We're going to have opportunities to sit around a dinner table. Every single person sitting at that table is going to be feeding their face with all kinds of baked goods and really enjoying themselves. It's a great opportunity for us to give thanks to God for the many things that He's done for us, for Himself, for His character, for His attributes. And it stirs up conversations with other people, inevitably. Church is charged with these things. So let me ask couple more follow-up questions. Getting our mind in gear. What happens when a church focuses on one of these things to the exclusion of the rest of those things? Let's say a church focuses solely on outreach and evangelism. What inevitably happens to that church? That's their identity. They become a seeker-friendly church. Right? Because that's their main goal is outreach. We've got to get as many lost people in here to give the outreach that we possibly can. And they neglect the believers who are hungering and thirsting after righteousness, because every message that's preached is preached for the sole reason of evangelizing those outside of the church. And I see interviews all the time with preachers who are famous, who aren't afraid to say, our church is the place for unbelievers to come. And there are people starving to death inside the walls of that place. because they've neglected everything else to the exclusion of evangelism. So these things are basket for the church. All of these. One more question and I close. We're out of time. This question is actually going to provoke some of you, but I must admit that's the reason that I'm asking it. This leads to what John talked of earlier. What is the context and the outlet of our spiritual gifts? In other words, where are we supposed to use the gifts that God gave us? Where are we supposed to use them, class? I see people doing this. Does that mean on your lap? Inside and outside? Any want to specify that a little more? Anywhere we go? God gave us our spiritual gifts to use right here, in this place, for this body. When was the last time you used a spiritual gift? Body. Remember I said this one's going to provoke you, and that's the reason that I ask it. When was the last time you used your spiritual gift, this body? It doesn't have to be preaching, teaching, those kinds of gifts. Gift of service, the gift of encouragement. These are gifts that are used behind the scenes. When was the last time you used your spiritual gift, class? Was it last week? Was it this morning? Was it a year ago? Or are you sitting there saying, I have no idea? And worse yet, you're saying, I don't even know what my gift is. And yet I've been saved for 15 years. That should never be. God has given us spiritual gifts for the service of this local body. Yeah, we want to be pew sitters. I didn't find that one in the New Testament. Paul never speaks of pew sitter. I think they had stumps. Maybe back then it wasn't stump sitter. We did have pie there. It was good. Okay, church. Christ Church. This is where believers meet to perform the proper function of the church. Much deeper than church people. For next week, Don is going to go over the questions, go over the content. I know we didn't watch the video, but he can make up some of these questions to get us in gear, or we watch the video first and go over those questions. That's kind of the way this is going to roll. We watch the video, we answer the questions. So this week, I want you to look at that first lesson of the church. Go through there and answer some of the things you can answer without watching the video. We're going to watch that next week. But I want you to be in thought about, this is the church. What is it? What does it perform? What is it charged to perform? And are we performing that? Am I individually performing? Pray. Father, we thank you for your goodness, your kindness, your long-suffering. We thank you for the church. Father, I pray as we continue our worship this morning that you would use even this time this morning that we've had together already to prepare our hearts for the time of worship, as this is our act of worship as well. Father, I pray that what we do, what we sing, what we say, what we hear, how we think, all of those things today would be for your honor and glory and for our benefit. And we thank you in advance in the name of your Son.